Okay, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Gruneau.
Hi, and today we have international relations and security analyst Mark Sleboda, who's joining us from Russia to speak on Ukraine's invasion of the Kursk region and hopefully a few other things about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Welcome, Mark Sleboda.
Babette, Gary, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on The Grass is Greener.
Thank you.
It's great to have you.
So why don't we start out with how well things are going for Ukraine in the Kursk offensive? Obviously, you have always a lot of spin from the Ukrainian side that says everything is going well. And on the Russian side, I mean, you sometimes have the Ministry of Defense kind of making things seem a little better when they appear when Russia's having a hard time, or sometimes you see the Russian commentators on Telegram talking about how terrible things are when maybe they're really not. So, what's your evaluation?
Yeah, so I don't think that there's any question that the Kiev regime is still trying to spin this Kursk incursion as that it's moving forward and it's progressing and that it's a great thing, and they've managed to take a number of podunk hamlets and villages in a practically undefended backwater area of the border between the Kiev regime-controlled parts of Ukraine and Russia that was largely undefended, principally because it has no strategic value. There's nothing, certainly on the Russian side, that is of any strategic value, unless the goal was to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant, or to strike it. If that was the goal, okay, and then they failed in that goal, they would have had to seize it within the first 2 or 3 days, relying on speed, surprise, and mobility, and they didn't get that far. But other than that, I mean, it was a tactical success initially, in that some of the best remaining military units of the Kiev regime, many of them pulled off of already collapsing defensive lines at the real battle, the real contact zone in the Donbass, in the Pokrovsk and Toretsk areas, equipped with some of the best weapons remaining that the West had provided the Kiev regime. Some of their limited numbers of air defense pulled close to the border, some evidently new experimental electronic warfare systems provided by the EU, a number of HIMARS units, which they have lost, by my count, at least 4 of them in the last month in the Kursk area, and those are a very short supply. But the best of what they had left, they pulled up for this fool's crusade. And they successfully managed to, with this force, pass Russian border patrol and a defense force that consisted, to a pretty significant degree, a number of young Russian men, 18-year-olds, serving their 1 year of national service, much like countries like Israel and Sweden and other countries where people do a year of national service. These draftees, these young draftees, have not been used in the special military operation, the Russian intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict, and they were largely left out of it. But with this incursion that was picked, I think, principally because, or at least in part because, it was an undefended area of the border that they knew that they could overrun quickly, successfully, because they couldn't penetrate elsewhere, or they couldn't win on the battlefields in the east. And they felt, at least part of the rationale is they felt a need to change the narrative, to redirect the information war, which it often seems to me that the Kiev regime has been fighting more of an information war with their more of a should say a performance art directed at their Western patrons than driven by any military strategy. Okay,
Yeah.
again, unless if the nuclear
go in and raise a flag on Snake Island and then leave.
Yes, exactly. Very much like that. Or the beaches of the Kinburn Spit at the mouth of the Dnieper, or this Krinky fiasco on the other side of the Dnieper River, where they sacrificed thousands of Marines. It's a horrible way to fight a war. It must be said. But when you're entirely dependent on the whims of foreign political elites and their supply of money and military weapons, maybe that puts you in a position where you are thinking more of these things than military strategy. But that is a very short-term way of thinking, I must say, and it certainly hasn't done the Kiev regime any good. So initially they had some success. By their count, I think they say 100 settlements. I think it's more like 30. It all depends on what you count as a settlement, because this region of Kursk, right, it is extremely sparsely populated. These are literally, when I say podunk hamlets and villages, many of these that they're calling settlements are probably like 4 and 5 houses and a farm. I mean, seriously, there just isn't anything of any real strategic value in this area. The largest single settlement that they have taken, right, that they had to fight very hard for, and Russian forces may, I don't believe they still control anything, certainly within the quote unquote metropolitan area of Suja. But Suja is the largest settlement that they managed to take, and that was 5,000 people. That's the largest, by far the largest that they managed to take. Yeah. So it's, the Russian attitude seems to have been, now a lot of people will tell you that the Kremlin, the Russian government, had knowledge of this beforehand and let it happen as a trap. I can't say that is completely.
I just want to interrupt it to say for.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to throw in here, it won't mean anything to you, but just for our local listeners, that would be about 1/3 of the population of Whitefish Bay. It'd be a little bigger than West Milwaukee or Bayside.
Yeah. I completely understand. I'm originally from north central coal country, Pennsylvania, what we like to unlovingly call Bumfuck, Pennsylvania. And I come from small towns myself, so I'm well familiar. And the town that I was in Pennsylvania was larger than than Suja. But so some people think that the Russian government had knowledge beforehand and let it happen as a trap. They let them walk into it. I don't entirely believe that because I see no signs of preparation beforehand. And if they were going to do it, I have to believe that there are certain preparations, certain trenches, fortifications, certainly around the Kursk nuclear power plant, that they would have done beforehand, that they would have had reserves available to bring in sooner than the 3 days it took them to get there. For 3 days, a withdrawing action was successfully fought, in that it slowed down the Kiev regime forces and prevented them from, for several days, from seizing Suja and progressing really any further towards the Kursk nuclear power plant. This was done by border patrol, local police, and draftees. Really, that they fought and slowed them down. And there were auxiliary forces, Russian auxiliary forces in the area, drivers, mechanics, cooks, right? And they fought, and they lost some. They surrendered at certain points when they ran out of ammunition. But they managed to slow the Kiev regime forces down long enough for the Russian government. Now, there's a question of the intelligence and military intelligence failure that the Russian government had. How did they fail to detect this buildup of forces, right? And give the Kiev regime credit, and really, I think there is certainly in the Ukrainian press, in the Ukrainian media outlet Resident, it was announced right away that this was fully supported by NATO, whatever they may say otherwise, and that it was actually planned by British intelligence, right? That they had, and the to support that, the British newspaper, The Times, said that some of the forces involved in this were specifically trained for this in the United Kingdom. So there's that to support it.
I'm surprised the Ukrainians managed to keep it quiet.
Yeah. I was just going to get to this. See, the last NATO proxy offensive in the summer of 2023, there were trailers. They literally made cinematic trailers for it, right? It was the most hyped offensive in world history. They were months ahead of time. The projection.
So they were really thinking Hollywood.
They were Hollywood. You maybe you could say Bollywood. I don't know. I guess at time it did seem a bit of a theatrical performance that really needed a song and dance routine. They certainly learned their lesson from that. So they had fairly tight operational security. Now there were rumors, but there were also rumors that this would be just a diversion, that the real offensive would come again in the Zaporozhye region. And by the way, there may still yet be another crazy Hail Mary offensive by the Kiev regime in the Zaporozhye region towards Energodar and the Kursk nuclear power plant. That may yet be coming. Yeah, sorry, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. You're absolutely correct. Which they've tried to seize several times before with amphibious assaults. But remember that the Kakhovka reservoir is no longer there because they blew up the dam last year, and now it's relatively dry. Of course, they say it was Russia that blew up the dam, of course, just like it was Russia that blew up the Crimean Bridge and Russia that blew up Nord Stream, and the Russians in Donbass who were shelling themselves for 10 years and so forth and so on.
According to our press here, Russia does a lot of shelling itself.
Yes. Those crazy Russians, suicidal. It's really inexplainable. Yeah, so I don't believe it was a trap. I think there was a failure at some point. Maybe the Russian government was deliberately fed disinformation that the offensive would come somewhere else and that this was just a distraction, and maybe they bought into it. But for whatever reason, once the Kiev regime went in, the Russian military was like, oh, you think we're going to pull forces from the front to deal with this? They sent more forces to Pokrovsk, this vital supply lines that Russia's breakthrough in the central of Donbass is severing the artery of right now in Pokrovsk and Selidova and Karakhova. So if there was some fantasy that Russia would divert forces in order to deal with this, it was the exact opposite way around, 180 degrees. The Kiev regime pulled forces from the Donbass for this fool's crusade. So I think that actually the Russian government has been quick to exploit this strategic blunder, and they are in no hurry to drive the Kiev regime out of these podunk villages, right? Russia is enormous, right? 1/6 of the Earth's land surface is Russia. A couple of a few dozen square kilometers of forested, sparsely populated podunk settlements in the Kursk region. They're willing to sacrifice this for what they consider to be an existential war for a time. They have turned this into a fire bag, right? It was always going to be very difficult for the Kiev regime to maintain logistics and supply to the forces that they try to drive in and entrench. The problem is that this is an area that they can defend. They came out of well-built defensive fortifications into these podunk villages and settlements. And while there is a certain amount of ability to hide in forests, that works both ways around, and the Russian military diversion and reconnaissance groups are playing, hide and go seek hunting for their Kiev regime equivalents in the Kursk forests. But they don't have high rise buildings that they have in the Donbass region. They don't have factories. They don't have coal mines. They don't have these hilltops that are easily turned into defensive fortifications and positions. Their forces have nowhere to hide, and Russia is happily using their artillery advantage, their air superiority, their Fab glide bombs, their drone advantage, and they have destroyed an enormous amount of Western equipment that is not easily replaceable. And of course, the erosion, the attrition of the Kiev regime's best remaining manpower, their best remaining combat troops, and we see what's happening in the east because of that. That towns like Novogorodovka and Selidova are just overrun because the Kiev regime military commanders have complained to the Western media and the Wall Street Journal that the forces that they were given as replacements for their good remaining troops that were sent to Kursk, these are people that were violently and forcibly conscripted off the streets of Ukrainian cities like a week or two ago and sent to the front, and they don't understand why they're not fighting and dying at their positions like previous Ukrainian units were. Go figure. I don't understand. I can't really understand it myself. But it's not going well for them, and it's not going well in Kursk now. The attrition rate is ridiculous high. They just have not been able to progress any significantly further in the last 2 weeks. Now, I think you're right that in the first, I would say, a little over a week to 10 days, they were still expanding, right? They were, and the Russian government was saying it's stable after like 3 days, right? And I'm like, no, it's not. It's not stable. They're still expanding. I can see which settlements they're moving into, right? That are, everyone agrees on. And the Russian blogosphere was I think at points calling out the Russian government and saying, hey, you better get reinforcements there quick because they are still expanding. And for about 10 days, they had limited expansion. But after that, they have not been able to get any further. They have not been able to get any further towards the Kursk nuclear power plant than the village of Karenova, where they're still fighting in 3 weeks later. They're still trying to break into and get a foothold there. And it's just too late already. The manpower that they've suffered, the equipment, the danger to their supply lines of being hit on 3 sides by Russian artillery, Russian drones, Russian air power, it's already having its cost. They've completely run out of steam in the last over a week, and now the initiative is starting to shift to the other direction, and slowly Russia is starting to squeeze them out, but they're taking their time about it. They want to make sure that all of the Western equipment that are you guys sure you don't want to put any more in? If you want to put a little more in, we can wait a little bit longer. That's what it is. Now, there are many Russians that are upset about this. Obviously, the 120,000 people in the broader area, right? That's not just the contact. The area controlled by the Kiev regime, but in the Kursk area and the neighboring Bryansk area, roughly 120,000 people were evacuated, and they're not happy. And then, of course, would you be? No, I certainly wouldn't. No. And the fact that the Russian government isn't doing everything possible immediately to evict the Kiev regime is making some Russians angry, but it's also perplexing the Kiev regime's, political leadership and the West, who still don't understand Russia at all. And certainly they don't understand the Russian military, and they don't understand attrition warfare at all. They've always kind of scoffed at it and looked down their noses at attrition warfare, right? They know the Jedi secret art of maneuver warfare. Why would they stoop to studying attrition warfare? That's the way they think in the U.S. military, which I can attest to.
Yeah, Russia had to evacuate, 0.1% of its overall population? I mean, it's that's the political effect of that can't be huge.
No, it's not. The Russian president suffered a 2 percentage point drop in the trust rating.
And he's doing this. He's doing
this.
This is right after he wins an election anyway, so he's got a long wait before he has to come around.
He dropped from 78% to 76% trust rating as a result of that.
What you're saying is the regime's about to fall.
Yeah. If the goal was to politically destabilize Russia and turn Russian popular support away from the SMO, the Russian intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict. Well, obviously it hasn't worked, but that's been their hope and a prayer with sanctions and everything else from the very beginning. And it just shows, to my mind, how bad the Russian experts, right, in the blob, right, as Ben Robes turns it, in the permanent bureaucracy of the State Department and the intelligence community, of the expert community in American and other Western universities and commentariat. The Russian experts are terrible. They are all ideological creatures who are driven more by American and Western exceptionalism and hatred of Russia than any real understanding of Russia or the Russian people, and it has led them the primrose path so many times.
You wouldn't even need really to have deep and profound understanding of the Russian people. You can just watch what they've done and see just empirically that it doesn't make any sense. I mean, this idea that they're going to abandon the Donbass for this area when the strategic objective of the war, right? The first of their 3 objectives was to liberate the Donbass. And it's like, when have they done that before, right? I think they keep expecting the same types of results over and over, and they just don't occur. They thought the Russians were all going to flee with their great counteroffensive last summer, and what did we see, right? That it didn't happen, and they're expecting the same thing to happen again, and it's not happening.
What do you expect when your experts that advise on Russia are people like Victoria Nuland and Michael McFaul? I mean, really. Yeah. I mean, that's the result. They keep doing, the definition of insanity, doing the same things over and over again, hoping for a different result, because the Russia and the Russian people that they have in their heads has nothing to do with Russia and the Russian people in reality. And I associated with these people. I studied these people at the London School of Economics. I heard many of them. I know what they think of Russia and the Russian people. And, I guess if your enemy keeps doing stupid things, well, then, don't stop him from doing those stupid things. And of course, as long as that doesn't lead us to World War III, that is.
Yeah.
There's a certain
point. Otherwise, you can let them keep putting more of the best troops in, and otherwise you were going to have to go hunt them in Western Ukraine anyways. Let them come to you.
Exactly. If there was any real danger of them expanding, of them reaching the Kursk nuclear power plant, for instance, at this point, I would be the first one screaming the alarm. Right. I was screaming the alarm early on when the Kiev regime was starting their conscription, starting mobilization immediately in 2022, and Russia wasn't. And I was very concerned at the time that Russia did not have enough troops, which they did not. And it was a terrible mistake. And it cost them the first year of the conflict because they were counting on a political settlement. That's what they sent, a very small intervention force of just 100,000 troops into Ukraine to do, a size that was less than half the size of the Kiev regime's standing military at the time. So I've criticized the Russian military, the political plans of the Kremlin, at least dictating the military many times in the past. But I do not see a problem. I don't like seeing villages and hamlets in Kursk occupied, but I realize that this is a conflict not just against a regime in Kiev that is driven very much by an anti-Russian Banderite ideology and vanguard, but against essentially all of NATO as well. But at this point, the Kursk is safe for Russia. They're not concerned about it. Putin within a week of it breaking out, a little over a week, Putin was off to Azerbaijan, right, on a state visit. Why? Because everything was well in hand. The Russians were satisfied. And I think that the Western press in the past week has started to come around to realizing, after the initial euphoria of, we're giving it to the Russians wore off, what a strategic blunder this is. And now that they're seeing these outlying towns on this logistics and supply arteries in the Pokrovsk area falling within days, and for the first time, cities, towns in the Donbass are falling into Russian hands essentially intact, right? They're not destroyed. They didn't have to destroy every building. Every building turned into a firing point and a mini fortress. Novogorodovka and now Selidova are being taken essentially intact because the Kiev regime does not have enough men left. They certainly don't have enough trained and combat ready men, and they don't have ammunition. They don't have artillery shells. They don't have weapons. It was all diverted to Kursk. And the interviews that even the New York Times have done with people in the trenches, in the Pokrovsk area, in the falling Toretsk agglomeration, what was once the Toretsk, New York agglomeration, now it's just half of Toretsk, they're all saying the same thing. We haven't seen any uplet of pressure, exactly the opposite. And at the same time, they took our best people. They took all our ammunition. They took all of the artillery shells. We're getting nothing. We can't hold. And well, that's the result.
The contrast is striking when you look at these big fortress cities like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where the Ukrainians just would not leave them, right? No matter how bad things got, they just kept putting forces in and just holding them until there was nothing left of the place. And now you're seeing the exact opposite, where things are they're just streaming out.
There's a Kiev regime Rada member, a member of their parliament, Marina Bezuglaya, whom is something of a hawk, but a contrarian hawk. She used to be part of Zelensky's Servant of the People party, and indeed it seems that she served as his attack dog against their former top general Zaluzhny at one point. But now she's apparently had a falling out, or she has political ambitions of her own, and she's become kind of a contrarian hawk, warning about how bad things are getting and talking down, calling Kursk, I think, the blunder that it was. But she actually went to Pokrovsk, right? She went to see the fortifications there, the defensives that have been, supposedly arranged. And she said there's no one there. There's no one in the trenches. There's no one in the fortifications. She says there's bugs. There's some are grasshoppers and stuff, and that's it. And she's warning that she actually, in a conspiratorial vein, I believe, it was suggesting that Zelensky is just giving up the Donbass at this point, that they've made a calculation that they can't hold it, and they're certainly, if that's the case, then they're still leaving thousands of people to their death rather than withdrawing them. So I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think they're going to give it a fight for what they can at Pokrovsk itself. That will be, they'll try to hold that position at least as long as they can. Zelensky's promising to turn it into another Bakhmut, which I don't think he can do. This isn't 2 years ago. The Kiev regime military is not what it was 2 years ago, and the Russian military is not what it was 2 years ago. They have a very much stronger, numerically stronger, equipment stronger, tactically stronger. They have this urban assault routine down pat now. And their Fab glide bombs they just destroy any fortification instantly, right? They've got them in the 500, 1,500, and 3,000 kilogram varieties, right? We're talking a ton, more than a ton bombs, right? And they just instantly, and now they're on, they're glided, like the USJ dams. And they've just proved devastating to hardened fortifications. And since Russia has started using them extensively in Avdiivka, and since then, it's just been a steamroll. So I don't think that they can hold Pokrovsk for, certainly not as long as they did Bakhmut or Mariupol or even Avdiivka. Things are just moving much faster now on the battlefield. And the real problem for them is not just will taking Pokrovsk sever the artery of their supply lines and their logistics. The railroad in the Donbass goes through Pokrovsk, the vital railroad that they use, several vital highways. It's a very important transport hub. But also, past Pokrovsk, to the west of Pokrovsk, there is nothing. It's largely unpopulated steppe all the way to the Dnieper River, to Pavlograd and the Dnieper River.
Smooth sailing.
Yes, well, it's just completely undefendable. There's nothing there.
So I wanted to ask, you mentioned the new experimental electronic weapons that have been given to Ukraine, or that the Ukraine is using in the Kursk area and maybe some other areas. Does that mean that they actually know how to use them, or along with the weapons, did Western specialists come to basically maneuver them, to use them, to, or maybe just to aid?
Well, what type of electronic warfare are we talking about? Are we talking about like hijacking drones or jamming things? What exactly?
Yeah. So, for those of you who aren't aware, electronic warfare has been a huge part of this conflict, right? The Soviet military, then the Russian military, in response to what at the time during the Cold War saw as NATO's superiority in power projection, in air power, and then later in stealth technology and the like. They focused on two primary areas of military response that they saw as an asymmetric response to counter NATO. And that was air defense and electronic warfare. And that's why still today, and Russia has continued that legacy, Russia, by most, grudgingly however much, even most Western military experts agree that Russia has an edge in and is certainly in deployed and advanced air defense and electronic warfare, the best in the world. And that has been telling. And there have been numerous articles in the Western media that have admitted this, we've seen articles headlining that Western weapons work until they don't, because the Russian electronic warfare adapts. It's kind of like the Borg, right? Yeah. If you're a Star Trek fan, right? You get 3 shots with those phasers and that's it, and they've adapted, and then they don't work anymore.
Yeah, they figure out, you bring in the HIMARS and like it takes a couple weeks, you get a couple hits in with the HIMARS, and then they figure out how to counterattack with the HIMARS and how to protect themselves.
Yes. The HIMARS, the Storm Shadows, the ATACMS, right? They've all been wonder weapons. The JDAMs, the ground launched small diameter bombs, right? Various types of drones. Russia has rendered them all impotent largely wherever they have electronic warfare deployed. And Russia has a very rich variety of electronic warfare equipment and a lot of new things that are they're evolving it very quickly with this conflict. The weapon evolutionary cycle on both sides is just moving incredibly fast. And with the preponderance, the rise of drones, right? Drones used for reconnaissance, drones used for artillery spotting, very important part of this conflict, but also strike drones and FPV drones and loitering munitions, all of these things that we're seeing, and increasingly small robotics on both sides being used. Electronic warfare is the way to counter that. You just cut the signal, right? All this guided GPS, US guided munitions provided, they can cut the GPS signal, and then it's just a useless hunk of metal. hurtling through the air. I would say that while Russia has overwhelmingly, and the Western press, again, military experts, again, when you're reading something seriously, grudgingly admit it, they've had a huge advantage in this and over this conflict. Now, what I'm talking about happened in Kursk in the first few days. This is, I would say, unconfirmed. There has been chatter about it, right? That certainly it seemed to me, and I heard other people, Russian war bloggers and journalists on the ground, saying that the Kiev regime was exhibiting electronic warfare capabilities that they never had before. Whereas before it was all Soviet legacy stuff. Suddenly they had some new things. And one of the big things they were doing is stopping Russian reconnaissance drones, right? They were jamming signals. Russian reconnaissance drones weren't flying. But also the FPV drones that now form part of essentially, defense networks, right? To hit, incoming vehicles, APCs, unloading troops and the like. So about the first 2 days, the Kiev regime had a huge advantage there. They were also cutting Russian communications with electronic warfare to a degree that they had not exhibited before. So the first 2 or 3 days, they had an advantage. Now, Russia's own electronic warfare then kicked into gear, and there was a bit of an electronic warfare war. And within a week, Russia had regained the advantage there. And I suspect that a number of those, of what I suspect was a very small number of European systems provided to the Kiev regime forces were destroyed. Maybe some of it was captured, which would be disastrous. But, these things happen in war. They had a brief advantage that helped them in the first surprise assault, the first couple days. They unveiled some tricks that they hadn't before with electronic warfare that caught the Russians a little by surprise. But within then, the Russian electronic warfare was striking back. Starlink was cut off again, something that the West said could never be done. Starlink couldn't. Well, Russia has at many times now been able to block Starlink from the battlefield over localized areas, and they did it again. So, people in the Pentagon and people in their military equivalent in China are paying very close attention to the drone and electronic warfare war, right, that is going on now. This conflict still has one foot in the past, right? The wars of the 20th century, and the other part of it is drones and robotics and electronic warfare, because the next conflict, right, let's say it is the Chinese, U.S., the inevitable Thucydides trap, naval and air combat off the Chinese coast, the South China Sea. That will be all missiles and drones and naval and air engagement and electronic warfare, of course. And they are hopefully, well, I would imagine that the Americans are taking notes. I certainly know the Chinese are. That combat will be I think, the first real future combat, more than likely, but everyone is learning lessons from what's being done here, even though this is largely a land-centric war.
We're even seeing a little bit of that in the Middle East now, with the hypersonic missiles and things being used over the Middle East, and we're sure. I think you're absolutely right. This is such a strange dichotomy that you have, like, old armor being pulled out of museums to be put into use in Ukraine, and at the same time, You've got these like incredibly advanced systems that the face of warfare is changing, and everyone has to look because this is all new, and with both sides advancing so quickly, and Russia particularly being able to adapt so well, and all these new things coming online. Everything is new. I mean, it must be hard for someone like you, who's an analyst like this, to try to keep up with all the changes.
Oh, it's incredibly hard, right? And we don't have perfect information, right? We don't have intelligence agencies to draw from. But at the same time, in a very perverse way, because, I mean, if we haven't talked before, full disclosure, my wife is from Crimea. right? From Simferopol. I have my mother-in-law, my in-laws are there, and we have family in Donbass, in Kharkov, in Odessa, right? We've got family all over East Ukraine. So I've got, you know, um, definite interest in this conflict. I've got, skin, blood and skin in this conflict. So, of course, on one side, it's extremely worrying and tense and personal. At the other hand, this is extremely exciting. When I have been talking about electronic warfare and things like this before this conflict happened, eyes just glass over, and no one's interested or paying any attention, and because when the US is spending decades fighting counterinsurgency wars against tribal Islam across the Middle East, which you don't have to worry about electronic warfare or cruise missiles coming back on you, or drone, and everything. But increasingly, that's changing now. That's changing now, though. If you take a look, what's happening in the Red Sea, the Houthis, right, our Salah movement, although certainly they're getting help. They have had help, and they are getting some help from the Iranians. It's amazing what they are able to produce on their own in terms of drones and cruise missiles, and they claim hypersonic missiles, far be it from me to disagree with them. But they've driven the U.S. Navy out of the Red Sea.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
It's funny. I mean, it's like the first I ever heard of Ivan Kachanovsky wasn't about Ukraine, right? Even though he's now trotted out everywhere as a Ukraine expert because he's from there, right? And this is what he does. But the first I ever heard of him was when he was writing about how much support really does Iran provide to the Houthis, right? That's where I first encountered his work, and he didn't think it was really all that much.
No.
And I just want to one other callback, and that's Alfred McCoy, a professor here in Wisconsin, wrote about electronic warfare between U.S. and China like 10 years ago. I was just saying, look, we think we're the big superpower, but if we were ever to get into war with China, their electronic warfare would just dominate the conflict, and they would win easily. And now we're seeing war games between the U.S. and China where the U.S. just can't figure out a strategy where they can win.
I think it's already that window has closed already. I mean, it depends on where the conflict is
before they got too far ahead, and they're too late.
Yeah, it's too late. Yeah, I mean, it depends on where the conflict is, right? Assuming the conflict is off China's coast and the South China Sea, and the U.S. provokes it, a deep water conflict that occurred in the middle of the Pacific, a blue water that might be a different story. But of course, we all know that's not the type of battle that's going to happen. The type of battle that would happen would be a battle for the U.S. Thucydides trap thinking, trying to preserve their hegemony and containing China and supporting separatism in Taiwan. That is where the conflict would be, and it will be like picking a artillery heavy attrition war conflict in Russia's backyard in the middle of Eurasia. That it will be as intelligent as doing that, right?
Yeah, not smart.
Yeah, not smart. You don't give the enemy the fight that he wants.
Yes.
But when you're the hegemon and you're trying to extend and maintain your hegemony, well, then of course you're going into people's backyards, and that's what's provoking these conflicts.
As they say in The Princess Bride, one of the classic blunders.
Blunders. One of my favorite lines in all of moviedom. Thank you.
I did want to clarify this. Do you think that the U.S. or Europe is actually manning the electronic weapons? Or
yes. Yeah, I can't imagine. I think this was a very limited number, but I can't imagine that they could train them. So they would have been quote unquote mercenaries, right? And we've heard this before, right? We've heard this not from the rumor mill, right? We've heard this from Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany. We've heard this from German generals who were caught on tape plotting to use Taurus missiles to attack the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. We've heard this from the foreign minister of Poland and the Estonian defense minister, all of them saying that, every NATO country has troops on the ground in Ukraine. Mostly these are trainers, advisors, the old Vietnam, but also special forces and commandos and specialists. And they're operating these specialist systems, right? They have to program in the targeting coordinates for the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, the British and the French. And it is the Americans who are still firing the HIMARS and in particular the ATACMS. There's just no other way. You can't train up the Kiev regime forces to be able to do this in the limited amount of time that they've had. Yes, if for what small, I don't think it was a huge amount, and I think it was experimental, but I have no doubt that there were some Western experts, military experts, Europeans probably, operating those systems, and I don't think those systems are operating anymore.
One thing I wanted to get to before we run out of time. There's this research that got some British airplay regarding like the incredible abundance of Nazi iconography that was found among Ukrainian troops as in part of the Kursk offensive, right? So they have at least 1,000 instances of Nazi regalia, German helmets, SS symbols, everything. I mean, I can think of like 100 images I've seen just from this, right? And one of my thoughts of that, I have a lot of questions about it. I mean, certainly it's nothing new for people who've been paying close attention that there's a lot of Nazi symbolism and a lot of Nazi iconography, on the Ukrainian forces. But the fact that this is coming out so prevalently now in the British media, really suggests to me that they're looking for reasons to cut Ukraine loose now, right? They're trying to give an explanation for why we might walk away from this conflict.
Yeah, I don't see that. I have to be honest. Certainly, the United Kingdom is still pushing actually the U.S. towards escalation with the long range strikes into Russia with Storm Shadows and ATACMS and the like. I don't think the British are going to walk away from this. And a few scant notices in the Western media, it will be back in my opinion, in 15 minutes, it will be back to the see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil of whitewashing and apologism. I prefer actually to identify it as Banderite fascism, right? The West Ukrainian homegrown variety of fascist, neo-Nazi ideology and its prevalence within the Kiev regime, not just the military, but politically as well. And I mean, it's amazing how all of this was actually acknowledged at one point. I mean, it was said that Azov was a neo-Nazi state within a state in the Western media by no less than Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty said that in 2019. Look it up. This was acknowledged and then it was whitewashed away, because if you admit that these, like supporting head chopping Wahhabist jihadis in Syria and Libya and Kosovo and in Afghanistan in the 80s, or supporting right-wing death squads in Central and South America, right? Supporting Banderite fascists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. You can't admit that, because that would, inevitably lead you to, are we the baddies, right? That we are supporting forces like this around the world. But all of this has been done before. Politico actually did a report on this. Operation Red Sox was a CIA attack on the Soviet Union in the 1950s using the Banderite fascists, the Waffen SS Galician Division, these former West Ukrainian forces that had fought for Nazi Germany, that had the CIA scooped them up. Right, they were secreted away to Canada and the U.S. and they were brought back, and they attempted led by the CIA on the ground to start an insurrection in West Ukraine in the Soviet Union in the 1949, early 1950s. Of course, it failed dramatically. But the point is that the US has a long history of supporting Banderite fascists in Ukraine against Russia. Then it was the Soviet Union. But as far as, geopolitical thinking goes, it's the same thing. So all of this has happened before. And the Western media, they covered it up at the time, and they're covering it up again. And they'll, briefly admit to it, and then they'll be back to, the whitewashing of it again, and it will, just slip by the narrative as it always does. Why? Because we're the good guys. They're the bad guys. That's the way it is. And good guys don't support fascists.
I mean, one thing that's interesting is Noam Chomsky used to say that we had all these small attacks that we were perpetrating against the Soviet Union in the early post-war era, and they all stopped when Russia got nuclear weapons, right? And we haven't had these types of incursions for decades, and now we're seeing them come back again. And Russia, still a nuclear power, right? It's just
yep.
That used to be a deterrent, and now it just isn't. It slows us down, right? There's still some hold back, right, on escalation, but it hasn't absolutely stopped this from occurring, right? That's a historical change.
Yeah, it's a change because the realists no longer have any power in foreign policy circles, in the blob in Washington, right? Now it's all American exceptionalists, right? What you could call neocons on one side and liberal interventionists or imperialists on the other side. The realists, the John Mearsheimers, the Stephen Waltz, they have no power anymore. And so the US foreign policy ideology has changed, and there is no longer the fear and respect that undergird mutually assured destruction and the Cold War security architecture. That architecture is now gone. It's completely gone. There's nothing left of it.
All the arms agreements are gone.
Yeah, the arms agreement, the Cold War security architecture, it's gone. The respect is gone. The fear is gone. And now there's just bewilderment. We can't possibly be being beaten by Nigeria with snow, by the country that produces nothing. They just can't accept that, right? Because that's the way they've caricatured Russia.
We're being beaten in the Red Sea.
Yes, by the poorest country in the world. Right.
Yeah. They were forced out of the Sahel, and we were forced out of Afghanistan. It's hard to think of a country that we managed to stay in.
Syria, you're still in Syria.
Oh yeah, Syria.
7 years, East Syria at least.
Yeah, still occupying a third of that country.
Yeah, sure is. And Iraq.
So, do you think that great efforts will be made to follow through with getting rid of the Banderites, getting rid of all Nazism that still lingers on in Ukraine? Will it actually be possible, or will they be protected by whether it's the CIA or NATO or whoever?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we don't know what the end game of this conflict is, and I'm personally of the mind that the West is giving Russia no choice but to remove the regime change the regime change in Kiev, right? That and to go all the way to the Polish border. I don't see that there's any other alternative at this point, no matter how many years further that might take. But decades of the Soviet Union couldn't get rid of Banderism out of West Ukraine, right? And that was under, Stalin and Khrushchev, and Putin is a lot softer than whatever his reputation in demonized in the Western mainstream media. And there was this reservoir of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, right? Of literally Banderite fascists in the US and Canada, that as soon as 1991 came around, right, they started gearing them up to re-inject that Banderism, to rejuvenate it, to re-nurture it in West Ukraine. And they did. They did. And that the result of that was all of the ideological vanguard and muscle and physical muscle behind the Maidan Putsch, and it was successful. Give them credit for it.
Yeah, there are some here in Wisconsin. There's statues and things to vandalism.
Yeah, two literal Waffen SS to Nazis. There are monuments and gravestones and all over the northern central U.S. and Canada. And that is a legacy of that Operation Red Sox. Check it up on Politico for those of you who don't believe me. It's all been exposed with the Freedom of Information Act. Again, it's nothing that any
the people
Western
who don't believe you aren't going to look it up.
Okay.
We've tried to talk to those people, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So sorry about that.
No, you're absolutely right.
So, I mean, we're almost at the end of our time. Is there anything else that we really need to talk about before you go?
Well, I would just say that I think that Russia is inevitably going to win this because it is a war of attrition. But as John Mearsheimer says, it will be an ugly victory. It will not be the victory that a lot of Russia's most vocal cheerleaders want or expect, I presume. The West is not going to give up. I very much fear that this will end in direct NATO military intervention at some point down the line, maybe when Russian forces start moving on Kiev or Odessa, several years down the road from now. But I don't think that this is going to end well. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it will be a long, hard, bloody slog. But, you don't poke and pick a fight with the bear in its backyard. It's going to come back and bite you eventually.
Yeah, Russia sees it as existential. It has no choice. But the NATO powers are run by crazy people. So
the West also, the U.S. political, the European political elite, they see that U.S.-led Western global hegemony is on the line. They view it as a world order determining conflict. They view it as existential, at least to U.S. hegemony as well. That's a very bad position. The Cold War had respect and fear and ideology on both sides. We're now in the realm of U.S. and Western exceptionalism, which is a messianic supremacist ideology that I believe is the most dangerous ideology in the world today.
All right. Well, that's a great place to end it right there.
If people want to follow you and want to get more information, where should they look?
So Substack, where I don't charge anything. My Substack is free. Of course, we're cut off financially from the West anyway, so it's not like you could credit card me money if you wanted to. But Substack or Telegram, The Real Politic with Mark Sleboda. I also have a YouTube channel, and I'm on Twitter, and I think I still have a Facebook account for those of you who are my age or older. I don't do much there, but Substack, Telegram, and Twitter are the places you want to go.
All right.
Well, thank you very much, Mark Sleboda, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to both of you.
Oh, thank you. Maybe we can have you back someday.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Cheers.